participating will have 6 minutes, and first up is Ms. Michelle Rempel Garner. So over to you for your 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Will the proposed cap emit new oil and gas projects now underway? Exempt, sorry.
I think for that type of question, it's actually outside of the purview of the Net Zero Advisory Body. Our job is to come up with key guiding principles to allow the Government of Canada to set the cap and to frankly determine the regulatory regime about how to administer that cap. So
as a guiding principle, do you believe that new oil and gas projects currently underway should be exempt from the cap?
Yeah, and we're actually not interpreting our role to get into that level of detail. We're interpreting our role to the letter of the tasking letter. And we are interpreting our role about emissions, not about production levels or new facilities or older facilities. It's really how would the government come up with a number about what in terms of carbon equivalents. Yeah.
Thank you. Will the proposed cap or would your guidance be to exempt reserves that are proven and on company books?
Again, that's a level of detail that we think is outside of our purview, and that would be up to the government to determine the specific regulatory regime about what's in and what's out. Our job is really to help them come up with a number about the cap and a number, what would at a carbon equivalent of emission level.
But if you're not giving principles on or guidance on those things, how can we be sure that this is a cap on emissions and not production?
Well, again, it's I would think you should refer that question to the government. It's their job.
But this is your job. Just to be clear,
yeah.
Do you believe that this should be a cap only on emissions and not on production?
Well, absolutely. And I think, we're taking our direction from the minister on that. The minister has been quite clear that he does not see this as a cap on production. It is a cap on emissions.
And so you've given no advice or guiding principles on the questions that I asked earlier with regard to reserves that are proven and on the books, approved oil and gas projects that might not have started yet. Has there been any guidance on those things at all?
That's a level of detail that really the government has to sort through. Our principles are going to be at a higher level than that.
Do you think that in terms of principles, announcing the cap without giving guidance on those things might lead to instability for investment in the oil and gas sector?
That's another question I think you'd have to ask the investment community about whether they consider giving preliminary guidance as policy certainty or preliminary guidance.
I thought you consulted with them. Did they tell you that?
We didn't get into that level of detail at all.
That's really unfortunate. I'll move on. Is your guidance giving any credence or room for complementary measures like carbon capture and storage or direct air capture?
So we don't get into the details. We're really trying to leave our guidance at the strategic level. However, okay. I can say that carbon capture and storage, we feel, is probably a very, very important technology for the world.
But that wasn't provided.
Let alone
that wasn't provided as part of your guidance. Do you provide any guidance on perhaps regulating, if we're proposing a cap on the oil and gas sector, simultaneously proposing caps on other emitting sectors like concrete, for example, in order to perhaps have equilibrium or a more cohesive approach to industrial emissions in Canada?
So again, our specific task is about coming up with principles that the government use to set targets forward for the oil and gas sector. I can tell you that what we have found, it's very difficult to do that in isolation. So coming up with a target number for emissions for the oil and gas sector really needs to take into account other measures.
Thank you. Did you provide any guidance on what types of substitute goods would be needed to achieve the reductions under as part of your guidance for the oil and gas sector, or let's say
can you explain substitute goods?
I'm just thinking, like, for example, if we're moving off of oil and gas, perhaps other products that could be used. I'm just trying to get a sense, because you haven't really told me there's a lot of questions here that industry, that the environmental community have on what guidance you've been providing. And I've just heard over and over again that you haven't provided that guidance. So maybe I'll try and structure my questions more on some of your modeling that you've used. Has any of your guidance accounted for potential carbon leakage by regulating or putting a hard cap on Canada's oil and gas sector, that we would be displacing that product or that production to other higher carbon emitting jurisdictions?
So one thing I'll just clarify here, I mean, most of your questions are looking for a degree of resolution that we're not interpreting as in our task. So, our principles or our thinking is at a higher strategic level to really make sure that the government has the responsibility to set the targets.
So what is
it's
it
not our job to
that
set
you
the
would
targets.
say that
it really needs to be elected officials.
Yeah. So what is it that you would say that you would do? Well,
that you've done? I'll answer your last question here about carbon leakage. One thing that we're quite adamant as an advisory body is to sticking to our mandate as is given to us in the Act and our terms of reference. And our Act, our mandate.
So you've provided a level
Pardon, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairperson, on a point of order, I apologise. I don't want to put a spanner in the members' works, but the speed is far too quick and the interpreters cannot keep up. I don't want Michelle to have to slow down. I know she's passionate about this topic, but if we could just have a little bit of a slower speed so the interpreters can do their job properly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simard, for your intervention. And I would, encourage people to allow one to finish before starting, because it does make it impossible for the interpreters to do their jobs and provide the translation. Unfortunately, I do have to cut us off here. That is the end of the 6 minutes. And